An 84-year-old woman vanishes in the middle of the night. No body, no suspect, no answers. And today, day 48, the silence has become something worse than noise. It has become a wall. Think about that number for a second. 48 days. That is not a missing persons case anymore. That is something darker, something that does not have a clean name yet. And the details surrounding the disappearance of Nancy Guthrie are not just disturbing, they are the kind of details that stay with you long after you turn off the screen. A masked figure caught on FBI surveillance footage crouching outside her front door. Male DNA recovered inside her home belonging to no one in her known circle. 40,000 tips flooding the investigation, and yet, as of today, not a single arrest, not a single person in handcuffs, not a single judge has signed a search warrant. But here is the part that nobody is talking about. The sheriff of Pima County has gone on record saying he believes he knows the motive. He says this was a targeted attack. He says the person responsible could strike again. So the question that has been sitting in the middle of this case like a loaded gun is this: if you know the motive, if you know this was planned, if you know the threat is still out there, then what exactly is stopping you from making an arrest? That is what we are going to answer today. If you have been following this case, if you have been losing sleep over it, if this is the first time you are hearing Nancy Guthrie's name, hit subscribe right now and ring that bell. At Verdict Vault CNN, we do not do surface level. We go in deep. We stay until the end, and we do not stop until every piece is on the table. Now let us get into it. Before we go any further, you need to understand who Nancy Guthrie actually is, because in cases like this, it is very easy for a person to become a headline, a statistic, a name attached to a crime number, and Nancy Guthrie deserves better than that. Nancy is 84 years old. In the language of criminal law, that classification carries specific weight. Investigators and prosecutors use the term extremely vulnerable person, and it is not a phrase they reach for lightly. It means someone whose age, health, or circumstance makes them significantly less able to protect themselves, to call for help, to fight back. It means the law recognizes from the very beginning that whatever happened to her was an act against someone who had no real defense. Nancy lives in Tucson, Arizona. She's the mother of Savannah Guthrie, the anchor of the NBC Today show. Since the night her mother disappeared, Savannah has stepped away from the cameras almost entirely. She has not given interviews. She has not held press conferences. She has stayed out of the public eye in a way that feels less like a media strategy and more like a person simply trying to survive an unbearable reality. The Guthrie family has kept their grief private, and that choice has earned them something rare in a case this public: genuine sympathy from nearly everyone watching. Nancy was living what appeared to be a quiet life. She was not a public figure herself. She was not involved in anything that would have made her a target in any obvious way. And that is precisely what makes this case so deeply unsettling. Because the investigators who arrived at her home in the hours after she disappeared did not treat this like a quiet case. They did not treat it like a welfare check. They did not treat it like a confused elderly woman who might have wandered off. They treated it like a crime scene, a violent crime scene, practically from the first hour. That decision, made in the darkness of that first night, tells you something critical, something that has shaped every single development in the 48 days since. When law enforcement seals a home and calls in forensic teams before the public even knows a woman is missing, it means they saw something inside those walls that removed all doubt, something that told them this was not an accident, this was not confusion, this was done to her. We are almost 2 full months now into this mystery. We're entering the 8th week of a search that has no end in sight, and the deeper you go into the facts, the stranger and more disturbing every layer becomes. What started as a desperate search for a missing elderly woman turned very quickly into something far more sinister. And today, on day 48, it is time to lay every piece of this case out in front of you, from the very first hour to right now, so that when the arrest finally comes, and it will, you are ready to understand exactly what it means.
The night Nancy Guthrie disappeared, something happened inside that house that the investigators have never fully described to the public. And that silence, that deliberate withholding of what they found in those first hours, is one of the most important unanswered questions in this entire case. Because the way law enforcement responded tells you more than any press conference ever has. Within hours of her disappearance being reported, the home was sealed. Not taped off with a single strip of yellow ribbon, sealed. Forensic teams moved in. The residence was treated from the very beginning as the scene of a violent crime, not a disappearance, not a missing persons situation, a violent crime. That is a distinction that matters enormously, because it means that whatever the first officers saw when they walked through that door, it removed any possibility in their minds that Nancy had simply walked away. Now think about what that means for everything that came after. On day 2, the Pima County Sheriff's Office stood in front of cameras and told the public that there was no threat to the community. Those were the words, no threat to the community. And on the surface, that sounds reassuring. It sounds like the kind of thing you say to prevent panic. But hold that statement next to what they already knew at that point, which is that the home of an 84-year-old woman had been sealed as a violent crime scene, and the statement starts to feel like something else entirely. It starts to feel like a contradiction that was never adequately explained. If you know this was targeted, if the evidence inside the home pointed to a deliberate act from the very first night, then how do you stand in front of a community and tell them they are safe? Either the threat was genuinely contained, which would require knowing who the perpetrator was, or the public was being managed rather than informed. Those are the only two explanations, and neither one of them is entirely comfortable. By day 3, something emerged that nobody saw coming. Reports surfaced of alleged ransom demands. Someone or a group of people was attempting to extort the Guthrie family in the aftermath of Nancy's disappearance. The financial movements connected to these demands were described by those who analyzed them as chilling. Not unusual, not suspicious, chilling. That word was used deliberately, and it suggests a level of calculated cruelty that goes beyond opportunism. A man was later federally charged in connection with these extortion attempts. He is facing serious charges in federal court. But here is the critical detail. His arrest did not bring Nancy home. His arrest did not answer the central question. The extortion case and the disappearance case appear to be two separate threads, and investigators have been careful not to conflate them publicly. What that means is that while one person has been held accountable for exploiting this family's terror, the person or persons responsible for Nancy's actual disappearance remain, as of today, completely unidentified in any official capacity. During those same early days, the entire Guthrie family came under the microscope. This is standard investigative procedure, and it should not be read as accusation, but it is worth stating plainly because it explains why so much of the early coverage felt fractured and strange. When someone disappears under violent circumstances, law enforcement looks first at the people closest to the victim. Every financial record, every relationship, every communication becomes a potential thread to pull. The family was scrutinized, and from everything that has emerged publicly, nothing pointed inward. Then came the footage. The FBI released images that stopped this case cold in its tracks the moment they went public. A figure, dressed in dark clothing, wearing a balaclava, a full face covering,
is seen in surveillance footage outside Nancy Guthrie's front door. Not passing by, not walking through the neighborhood, outside her front door. The posture, the positioning, the presence of the mask, all of it communicated one thing with absolute clarity. This person did not want to be identified. This person had planned to be there. This was not an impulse. The footage itself almost did not exist. The cameras at the property had recorded it, but the files had not been preserved in any obvious way. What the FBI managed was conduct a deep digital forensics operation on Google's servers, recovering data that most people would have assumed was gone forever. Investigators compared the process to peeling layers of an onion, layer after layer of deleted and overwritten data, carefully reconstructed until those images emerged. The pool, the backyard, the sides of the property, the front entrance, the garage, all of it recovered, all of it analyzed. And yet, despite that technical achievement, despite the fact that investigators managed to pull images from what felt like digital oblivion, the footage did not capture the moment Nancy Guthrie disappeared. The cameras were there, the coverage was extensive, but the critical seconds, the moment that would answer every question, those seconds are not on any recovered file. That fact alone should tell you something about the level of awareness whoever took Nancy was operating with. You do not evade 6 cameras covering multiple angles of a property by accident. You do not walk away from the front door of a home, vanish from every recorded frame at the exact moment it matters most, without knowing where those cameras were pointed. This was not luck, this was knowledge. And that knowledge narrows the universe of possible suspects in a way that investigators have never discussed publicly. 48 days in, a crime scene sealed in the first hours, a community told it was safe when the evidence said otherwise, a federal extortion case that did not solve the central mystery, a masked figure on FBI footage who walked away clean, and a set of surveillance cameras that captured everything except the one thing everyone needed to see. That is where the first week of this investigation left things, and it only gets more complicated from there.
There is a specific kind of frustration that comes with a case like this. It is not the frustration of having nothing. It is the frustration of having almost enough. Almost enough DNA, almost enough footage, almost enough tips, almost enough probable cause. The Nancy Guthrie investigation is a case defined not by absence of evidence, but by evidence that keeps stopping just short of the threshold that matters. Let us start with the DNA, because it is both the most promising thread in this investigation and the one that has caused the most pain for everyone watching it closely. Inside Nancy Guthrie's home, investigators collected DNA samples from multiple locations. They also recovered DNA from a pair of gloves found at or near the property. The results confirmed something significant. The DNA was male, and it did not belong to anyone in Nancy's known circle. Not a family member, not a regular visitor, not anyone with an innocent explanation for being inside that home. Unknown male DNA in multiple places inside the residence of a woman who vanished under violent circumstances. On paper, that sounds like a breakthrough. In practice, it became a wall. The problem is the nature of the sample itself. Forensic experts working this case have described the DNA as a complex mixed profile. That means multiple contributors, overlapping genetic material, partial sequences that do not resolve cleanly into a single identifiable person. Mixed DNA profiles are one of the most difficult challenges in modern forensic science. The more contributors there are, the harder it becomes to isolate any single profile with the precision required for a court of law. You can know with certainty that an unknown male was present. What you cannot always do is tell a jury exactly who that male was, because the data refuses to separate cleanly. Investigators submitted the evidence to CODIS, the national DNA database that contains genetic profiles of convicted offenders and certain arrestees across the country. If the unknown contributor had a profile in that system, a match would have surfaced. No match was returned. The submission was rejected or returned without a hit because the mixed sample was too incomplete to run a valid comparison. The forensic analysis is ongoing. Laboratory work continues, but as of day 48, the DNA has not named a suspect. Now layer that against everything else investigators are working with, and you start to understand the shape of this problem. The surveillance footage recovered from Google's servers, the product of that extraordinary digital forensics operation, covers almost every inch of Nancy's property. 6 cameras, multiple angles, pool, yard, sides, entrance, garage, all of it reconstructed from deleted server data. Investigators described the result as significant from a technical standpoint. The FBI was clearly proud of the work, and rightfully so, because pulling usable images from cloud servers after deletion is not a routine operation. It requires specialized tools, legal access to private infrastructure, and a level of digital forensics expertise that most law enforcement agencies do not have in-house. But the footage, despite everything it took to recover it, does not show what happened to Nancy. The cameras captured a presence, most notably that masked figure at the front door, but they did not capture the moment of disappearance itself. The critical window is dark. Whatever happened to Nancy Guthrie, it happened outside the frame of every recoverable image. That is not a coincidence. That cannot be a coincidence, and investigators know it. The SWAT operations that followed in the weeks after the disappearance pointed to something. Law enforcement had a direction. You do not deploy tactical teams without a theory. You do not send armed units to a location without some level of belief that the location is connected to your case. Multiple SWAT operations were conducted at undisclosed sites. The details of what was found or not found at those locations have not been released to the public. What their existence confirms is that investigators were not simply waiting for a tip to fall out of the sky. They were moving. They were pursuing something. Gun stores became another piece of this investigation that raised eyebrows when it surfaced. Investigators visited multiple firearms dealers in the area, showing employees specific names and photographs, asking whether they recognized the individuals, whether they had sold to them, whether anything unusual had occurred. The canvassing of gun stores suggests investigators were looking for a specific person or persons in connection with a specific type of threat. It's the kind of detail that, in isolation, seems strange. Inside the architecture of this case, it fits the profile of a targeted, premeditated act carried out by someone with operational awareness and access. And then there are the tips. 40,000 of them. 40,000 pieces of information submitted by the public, by neighbors, by people who saw something or heard something or remembered something and felt compelled to call it in. 40,000 tips means this case is alive in the public consciousness in a way that very few investigations sustain past the first 2 weeks. People are still watching. People are still paying attention. People are still picking up the phone. But 40,000 tips creates its own crisis. Every lead has to be logged, categorized, evaluated, and followed up on by investigators who are already stretched across an operation of this scale. The credible tips have to be separated from the noise. The actionable information has to be pulled from the volume of well-intentioned but ultimately useless submissions. It is an enormous undertaking, and it takes time that the investigation doesn't feel like it has to spare. Here's the picture that emerges from all of this evidence taken together. Investigators have male DNA from inside the home that they can't match. They have surveillance footage of a masked individual that they can't identify. They have 40,000 tips that they are still working through. They have conducted SWAT operations and gun store canvassing that suggest a specific direction. And they have, according to sources close to the investigation, not enough evidence to convince a single judge to sign a search warrant. That last point is not a small detail. That is the entire problem in one sentence. A search warrant requires probable cause. It requires an investigator to stand before a judge and say, here is specific evidence linking a specific person or location to this crime. Not a theory, not a feeling, not a direction. Evidence. And right now, despite everything, despite the DNA and the footage and the 40,000 tips and the SWAT teams and the gun store canvassing, the investigators working the Nancy Guthrie case cannot clear that bar. They cannot give a judge what a judge needs to say yes. This case is not cold. This case is burning. But burning and solvable are not the same thing. And right now, on day 48, the distance between those two words is where Nancy Guthrie is lost. If this breakdown is giving you something that you haven't seen anywhere else, that's what this channel is here for. Drop a like right now. It takes 1 second and it tells YouTube that this story matters, that Nancy matters, and it puts this video in front of the people who need to see it. Do it now, and let's keep going.
On a Tuesday morning, weeks into this investigation, the sheriff of Pima County stood in front of cameras and said something that should have stopped the entire country cold. He said he believed he knew the motive. He said this was a targeted attack, and he said the person responsible could strike again. Read those 3 statements slowly, because each one carries a weight that the news cycle did not give them enough time to sit with before moving on to the next update, the next development, the next detail that briefly captured attention and then dissolved into the noise of a case that has been generating headlines for 7 straight weeks. He knows the motive. That means this was not random. That means somewhere in the evidence collected from that sealed home, somewhere in the forensic work or the digital recovery or the 40,000 tips or the SWAT operations, investigators landed on a reason someone wanted Nancy Guthrie gone. A reason specific enough that the sheriff felt confident saying it out loud to a room full of journalists and cameras. Not a theory, not a working hypothesis, a belief firm enough to go public with. This was a targeted attack. That phrase eliminates entire categories of possibility. It eliminates the stranger who chose a house at random. It eliminates the opportunist who saw an open window and made a decision in the moment. Targeted means Nancy was chosen. Targeted means someone identified her, studied her, planned around her, and executed something with enough precision to evade 6 cameras and leave behind only a mixed DNA sample that forensic labs are still struggling to untangle. Targeted means the person who did this knew something about Nancy Guthrie before they ever stood outside her front door in a balaclava. And the perpetrator could strike again. That is a statement law enforcement makes casually. That is a statement with legal and ethical implications. When a sheriff tells the public that a dangerous individual is still free and still capable of violence, it carries a responsibility. It is an acknowledgement that the threat has not been neutralized, that somewhere out there, the person who took an 84-year-old woman from her home is still moving through the world, still making decisions, still a danger to someone. Now, hold all 3 of those statements in your mind simultaneously and go back to day 2. Go back to the press conference where the community was told there was no threat. Go back to the official reassurance that people could feel safe. Because if the motive was known, or at least strongly suspected from the evidence found in those first hours, then the Day 2 statement was not just incomplete, it was a decision, a deliberate choice about what the public was told and what the public was not told. And decisions like that do not happen by accident in an investigation of this scale. They happen because someone in a position of authority made a judgment call about what information the investigation could survive being public and what information it could not. That judgment call may have been correct. Protecting the integrity of an active investigation sometimes requires managing the flow of information in ways that look from the outside like contradiction.
But it also means that for 48 days, the people living near Nancy Guthrie's home have been operating on incomplete information about the nature of the threat in their community. There is another thread here that has been pulling at the edges of this case since the beginning, and on day 48, it has become impossible to ignore. In December of 2022, 4 University of Idaho students were murdered in their off-campus home in Moscow, Idaho. The case generated the kind of national attention that few true crime investigations sustain, and for 46 days, it appeared to be going nowhere. The suspect, Bryan Kohberger, was a criminology PhD student. He had driven past the house multiple times. He had left DNA. He had a digital footprint that investigators were quietly and methodically building a case around. And on day 46, from the outside, it looked like the trail had gone completely cold. 24 hours later, he was in handcuffs. Day 47 of the Idaho murders investigation produced an arrest that nobody outside law enforcement saw coming. The silence of day 46 was not the silence of a stalled investigation. It was the silence of an investigation in its final hours before everything became public. Today is day 48 of the Nancy Guthrie case. That parallel is not a coincidence that analysts have overlooked. It is the parallel that has been sitting in the center of this community of followers, this 40,000 tip-generating, sleep-losing, obsessively attentive group of people who have been watching this case from the beginning. Because the Idaho comparison is not just a timeline curiosity, it is a reminder that investigations do not look like progress from the outside. Sometimes the quietest days are the days when everything is about to change. The hope, and it is a real and legitimate hope, is that right now, in the hours and days surrounding day 48, something is happening inside this investigation that none of us can see. That the silence is not emptiness, that the absence of public announcements is not the absence of movement, that somewhere a prosecutor is reviewing an affidavit, that somewhere a forensic result has come back from a lab, that somewhere one of those 40,000 tips has finally connected to something that holds up in front of a judge. But hope requires honesty to stay credible, and the honest version of where this case stands is this. Sources close to the investigation have said, clearly and without ambiguity, that there is no suspect in the official crosshairs, that the evidence available right now does not meet the standard for probable cause, that the prediction made weeks ago that no imminent raids should be expected has proven accurate every single day since it was made. Those two realities exist at the same time. The hope of a day 47 breakthrough and the honest assessment of an investigation that has not yet found its footing on the most critical question of all. Those two things live together in this case, and pretending one of them doesn't exist would be a disservice to Nancy Guthrie and to everyone who has invested themselves in finding her. The Idaho case took 47 days. The Idaho case looked hopeless on day 46. The Idaho case ended with an arrest that changed everything and made every small detail from the previous 6 weeks suddenly make perfect sense. Today is day 48, and whatever is happening in the shadows of this investigation, it is happening right now.
There are 4 questions at the center of this case. Not theories, not speculation. 4 specific gaps in the official record that have never been addressed publicly, that grow more significant with every day that passes without an arrest, and that will matter enormously when this case finally breaks open. The first question is the one that started all of this. What did investigators find inside Nancy Guthrie's home in those first hours that made it seal it as a violent crime scene before the public even knew she was missing? This is not a small question. The decision to treat a residence as a crime scene rather than a missing persons scene is not made lightly. It requires something visible, something unambiguous, something that removes the possibility of an innocent explanation in the minds of the officers standing in that room. Whatever that something was, it has never been described publicly. The sheriff's office has not characterized it. The FBI has not referenced it in any detail. The family has not spoken to it. For 48 days, the thing that set this entire investigation in motion has been sitting behind a wall of official silence. When the arrest comes, when the affidavits are unsealed and the court documents become public record, that first night inside Nancy's home is almost certainly going to be the foundation of the entire prosecutorial case. Every decision made in the 48 days since traces back to it, and right now, none of us know what it is. The second question is the one that cuts deepest into the credibility of how this case has been managed publicly. If the motive was known or strongly believed from the evidence recovered in those first hours, then why were so many of the official public statements pointing in a different direction? Day 2, no threat to the community. Day 3, ransom demands treated as credible enough to pursue. Days that followed, family members under scrutiny. All of this happening while, according to the sheriff's own later admission, investigators believed this was a targeted act by someone still capable of violence. The gap between what the public was told and what investigators appeared to have believed internally is not a minor inconsistency, it is a chasm. And the explanation for that chasm, whatever it turns out to be, will tell you a great deal about how this investigation was run and whether early decisions cost precious time. The third question lives inside the forensic evidence. The masked figure captured on recovered surveillance footage outside Nancy's front door is the closest thing this case has to a face. Not an identified face, not a named suspect, but a physical presence, documented, recorded, recovered from deleted server data through an operation that the FBI compared to peeling an onion. That figure stood outside Nancy Guthrie's home. That figure was wearing a mask. That figure was there with intention. Does the unknown male DNA recovered from inside belong to that person? Has any forensic link been established between the figure at the door and the genetic material found inside? Investigators have never answered that question publicly. If the DNA and the masked figure are connected, it would represent the single most significant piece of evidence in this case. If they are not connected, it means there may be more than one unknown person whose presence needs to be explained. Either answer matters, neither has been given. The fourth question is the simplest and the most devastating. Where is Nancy Guthrie? No confirmed proof of life, no body recovered, no vehicle linked to her disappearance, no DNA database match, no arrest. 48 days after she vanished from her home in Tucson, Arizona, an 84-year-old woman is simply gone, and the people responsible for finding her have not been able to tell her family where she is. That is the reality of day 48. Not a cold case, not a solved case, a burning, active, resource-intensive investigation that has not yet found the answer to its most fundamental question. The family has said, repeatedly and without variation, that they are holding on to prayer, that they are refusing to surrender hope under any circumstance, that they believe Nancy will be found. Those are not the words of people performing optimism for cameras. Those are the words of people who have made a decision, consciously, to survive this by holding on to the only thing that cannot be taken away by the absence of evidence or the passage of time. And here, on day 48, that choice deserves to be honored rather than dismissed. This case has 40,000 tips still being processed. It has forensic labs still running analysis on complex DNA. It has investigators who conducted SWAT operations and canvassed gun stores because they believed they were moving in a real direction. It has a sheriff who went on record with a motive and a warning. It is not over. It has not gone quiet in the way that truly cold cases go quiet. The machinery of this investigation is still running. It's just running somewhere the public cannot see. And if the Idaho case taught us anything, it is that the machinery running in silence is sometimes the most dangerous kind. Before we close today, there is something I want to say directly to you. You have been here for this entire video. You sat with the evidence, you sat with the questions, you sat with the weight of a case that does not have clean answers yet. And that matters more than you might think. Because Nancy Guthrie is not a trending topic to the people who love her. She is everything. And every person who stays informed, who keeps this case visible, who refuses to let it slide into the background noise of the news cycle, is doing something real for a family that is holding on by a thread. You are part of that. So thank you for being here, genuinely. If this video gave you something, share it with one person who needs to hear Nancy's story. That's all. One person. It costs nothing, and it could mean everything. If you have any information about the whereabouts of Nancy Guthrie, the FBI tip line is open. The number is 1-800-CALL-FBI. That number is on your screen right now. Write it down. Share it. The case that breaks open the day after everyone stops paying attention is the case where a single tip made the difference. Here is the question I want to leave you with, and I want you to answer it in the comments below, because I read every single one. Do you believe this case will be solved by forensic evidence, or do you believe it will be a tip from the public that finally puts a name to that masked figure at Nancy Guthrie's door? Tell me what you think. Tell me what you have been noticing that nobody else is talking about. This community has eyes on this case that investigators do not always have, and that has value. Subscribe if you're not already here. The bell means you'll know the moment something breaks on this case, and when it breaks, it's going to break fast. Verdict Walt CNN will be here when it does. Nancy Guthrie deserves answers. Her family deserves answers, and we are not going anywhere until they get them.